Now we'll move on to our next speaker. We have Professor Anuradha Chenoy. Anu is joining us from India. She'll be joining online. She's a former professor and former dean of the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She was chairperson and director of the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. She has written many books, including 100 Years of the Russian Revolution, Re-emerging Russia, Institutions, Structures, Processes, the BRICS in International Development, and Human Security, Concept and Implications. So we're delighted to have Anu joining us online. So Pablo, if you can put Anu's video on and we'll get started. Thank you. Anu is...
Can I start? Thank you.
Online?
Yes, I'm online.
Okay, we're just
Okay.
getting your video. Ah, there you
Okay.
are. Perfect. Excellent.
Okay. Naam, co-panelists. Yeah, okay. Dear Naam, Jeffrey, other co-panelists and friends. Firstly, thank you IPB and other organizations for this honor. I express my solidarity with the peace movement at this time when war is presented as patriotic and peace as anti-national. So the peace community is roundly attacked because it is the resistance movement against wars. So what I want to say is that the European peace movement is not alone or isolated. The global South, that is the global majority, that is what was called the former Third World, is with this peace movement, even as they have their own internal conflicts and are no paragons of peace. But they can see this hybrid war impacts them, impacts the climate, the environment, the livelihoods, and makes them collateral victims globally. Now, 147 countries, including 100 from the global South, condemned the Russian aggression as illegal. But as the global South operationalizes their positions, three common points stand out. One, that most or the majority of the global South has moved to a position of neutrality. Two, they oppose sanctions, the unilateral sanctions. Three, they believe that the international system is now multipolar, where they have a choice or agency in choosing economic and security partners. And they have a stake in this multipolarity. So they believe that these three positions are conditions to a way to peace. So let me explain what they mean by this. First, on neutrality. So why neutrality? Entire regions from the South, the Gulf countries, Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia are maintaining neutrality, even as their elites are integrated into a globalized system and face massive and continuous pressure. Now, this neutrality is not as progressive like the non-alignment movement was during the First Cold War, whose principles included global disarmament and not joining military blocs and solidarity against colonialism. Today's neutrality keeps out of this conflict and advocates that all sides engage. Now, the reasons for this neutrality include memories of colonial oppression and the centuries of humiliations, the experiences from Cold War I, when many countries in the South, especially Southeast Asia, Latin America, faced repeated military interventions and direct hits from US imperialism, Jeffrey has just mentioned this. Whereas the Soviet Union was an ally. Further, there is a popular common sense that Western institutions treats equals unequally. And this is premised in the UN Charter and in the Security Council itself, where no one from the entire global South has representation. So importantly, the global South's official stance of neutrality is largely supported by public opinion in these countries. For example, public opinion over the last 1.5 years, whether in India, Brazil, Turkey, or the elections in Turkey, Indonesia, and others, show that the majority of people blame the US and NATO for this war, and they support neutrality. They favor good relations with Russia and consider the US adversarial. That is the mass of people I'm talking about right now. They see Western response in Ukraine as double standards. Despite being bombarded by images of devastation and these horrific incidents in Ukraine, they still measure this with interventions in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, the policies on Palestine. These are etched in the imaginary of the people of the global South. So the hegemonic positions of the collective West are seen as double standards, sadly. And it's seen that there is a discriminatory regime where the Western media discourse is complicit in this conspiracy of silence. Now, much of the global South frames this war differently than the West. It believes that NATO expansion, the civil war in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine following the 2014 coup, the violations of Minsk I and II created a theater of conflict, that this is a proxy war, and that Russia has legitimate security interests. And this word, legitimate security interests, you open the discourse from Malaysia, Indonesia, India. Anytime they've made an intervention, anytime they've condemned the aggression, they've all said this, that Russia's legitimate security interests also need to be safeguarded. And now this is a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and everyone must assist in ending this. And it is needed, this framing is needed for any peace negotiation. The second operational principle collectively in the global South is on the position on sanctions. Now, while over 100 global South countries condemned the Russian invasion, of these, about 95, all from the South, oppose sanctions. That is 75% of the world population. Especially because 75 countries have been subject to unilateral sanctions by the US. And 80% of the countries subjected to this unilateral sanctions have been from the global South. So despite the greatest and continuous pressure and threats from the collective West, and this is happening every day from the embassies of the collective West towards the least developed, the indebted countries, emerging countries of the South, name it. And further, the Western media calls the position that the global South has taken on opposing sanctions as being either transactional, opportunistic, unprincipled, but yet the global South collectively believes that sanctions are wars by other means. It is economic coercion. They impact ordinary people and not the regime. They are a collective punishment which is outlawed by international law. And unilateral sanctions have a semblance to imperial injunctions based on the past privilege and impunity, given the weight that the West has in international bodies, which is then translated into a discourse of international morality or binary between civilized and uncivilized, the garden and the jungle, or democrat versus authoritarian, etc. So for the global South, this opposition to sanctions is a moment of defiance. It's an act, of course, of national interest. They're gaining, from cheap Russian oils, but it is also an act of peace, of courage, and resistance. Imagine the weakness of the global South, the prevalent illiteracy, the oppressions, etc., and yet they've taken this position. The third common belief of the regime and the people of the global South is their commitment to a multipolar international system that is seen as an emerging reality, which they have a stake in constructing and upholding. Now, believe me and see any document, the global South is not anti-West. They're actually very pro-West in all ways. They want to be partners in development. But what they're saying about multipolarity is that they would like the West and Russia to be partners in their security and development. They would like China to be an economic partner and the West simultaneously to be an economic partner. So many regions, especially now you can see in West Asia, are looking for various guarantors of balance of power and sources of military and economic collaboration and support. They're looking also for leveraging between major powers for development gains, as many non-aligned countries did during the non-aligned movement during Cold War I. So the global South knows they need peace for development. Now, my last point really is about the peace proposals and appeals. These are not peace plans. The peace plans will be made between Russia, Ukraine, and whoever is backing Ukraine in this proxy war. So several peace proposals have come from China, backed by Brazil and Argentina. Now, the 6 African Nations Initiative, which will take place later. Mexico has appealed that weapons delivery be stopped. Indonesia, India, and others have said that this is not a time for war, that status quo be maintained, and so forth. So it is really historic that the South is appealing for peace to Europe and the North. So who blocks this peace? Peace can come the day when the West wants it. So in this, the European and US peace movements are playing a major role. The South was and will be for peace. Friends, let me tell you, the global South is not just a geographical metaphor, but it is a political consciousness. It's never had a hegemonic discourse or an hegemonic narrative. All the states of the global South have hollowed out their democracies. Many have repressive regimes. They have their own domestic multiple oppressions. We cannot justify these domestically. Many have autocratic regimes. Many are sub-imperial and aspire for regional hegemony. But the global South also has no coordinating center, no institutional structure. They function and speak autonomously with each other, yet they're understanding what Jeffrey just explained. Spontaneously ask anyone from the global street. So they are ready to endorse any proposal for peace that satisfies all sides and seeks common or collective security with an element of international human security. So lastly, we in the peace movement add our voices in distinct ways. Armistice, step away from bloc or Cold War paradigms, use diplomacy, security for all sides. It cannot be one versus the other. There can be no fragmented security or competitive security. The East is asking for international cooperation. The West is talking for international competition. The East is talking for plurality of the international system. The West is talking in binaries, us versus them. So we are looking really in different ways without saying it for common security. So really, global disarmament, peace and security is the only way forward, as is the construction of multipolarity. Friends, do listen a bit to what the global majority is saying on their own. Thank you very much.